Welcome. This is Jen the Liberty Lion. Today we're going to talk about states and freedom, the independent state and the dependent state. And I've been talking about this for quite some time now. And we're just going to go over this for some new viewers, new subscribers that we have here on this channel. And I'm going to talk a little bit about the legal name on the birth certificate. Now, the documents that I use are for Texas, but this is a basic outline that applies really to every state. When it comes to the federal government has federal lands, and the federal lands are where the United States is. The United States of America are all the free states together. So what does that mean? Well, let's start by talking about abstracts and abstracting. In a book by Wendell Johnson called People in Quandaries, he talks about the use of abstract words. And in one section of the book, he talks about the word statement. He says that it has no specific meaning. So now we're talking about the definition of words and how some people believe that the definition of words are changed. I don't believe that the definitions of words are or can be changed. They can only change what you believe the definition means, because words have meanings. But some words have a very general meaning. And so, for example, Wendell Johnson in his book uses the word statement. He says it has no specific meaning. Its exact and specific meaning is attached to the context to which it is used. So the word statement can mean a lot of different things. It depends on how you use it. And he goes on to say that many words have no exact meaning. Their meanings come from the way in which they are used, or in other words, related to the context, and that relation is the meaning or definition. So some of the examples of words that lack exact meaning are by listed in the book are words like yes, no, true, false, fact, reality, cause, effect, agreement, disagreement, proposition, number, relation, order, structure, abstraction, characteristic, love, hate, doubt. So I'd like to go over some general words without exact definitions or exact meanings that we find in the Constitution. When used alone, these words are without specific meaning, but within context, they have been given meaning. So the words used in the Constitution, taken out of the context in which they're used, words that have no exact meaning are words such as we, people, tranquility, general, welfare, justice, defense, blessings, liberty, common, powers, tax, consent, supreme, inferior, state, several, each, free, and so on and so forth. The Constitution gives some context to the words, but not a whole lot. We know that the founders' ideas placed within the document are vastly different from those of the political propaganda machine, which appears to have begun to alter the common person's perception of the meanings of the words since around the 1830s. Whether they had a benevolent purpose or purposes is not known, to me anyway, but I find that generally liars and deceivers do not have benevolent intentions, which is why it is necessary to lie and deceive. So what I'm saying here is that the context of the Constitution over time has changed through a propaganda machine. So Wendell Johnson in his books says, quote, Justin Pilate asks, quote, what is truth? If we recognize that the word truth has no actual, specific, and direct meaning, we realize that asking what is truth is a foolish question because it cannot be answered. It is nonsense. And he says that it's nonsense, such as the nonsensical lines you find in the book Alice in Wonderland. Such questions of nonsense are like this of asking of Alice in Wonderland, who are you? Or am I inferior? Because inferior is undefined. So inferior to what? Inferior to who? Are you inferior to what and to who? It's undefined. Such as inferior courts in the Constitution. Inferior is only defined when placed in relationship with the supreme. Inferior or lesser than a Supreme Court. Other nonsensical questions may be, quote, do they love me? End quote. Love is defined only in the mind of the person asking the question, since love to everyone may be different. Then we ask, what is a state? Or what state? We do not know exactly what is meant by state when state is undefined. So the word state alone, without any context, has a very, very general, broad meaning. So we must look to the context of the words used before and after the word state. So since we don't know exactly what is meant by state when state is undefined, we look to the context of the words before and after it's used. In the Constitution, we have, quote, particular state, end quote, quote, each state, end quote, quote, several states, end quote, and quote, no state, end quote. But in a greater sense of the words, we have two types of states when applied to political science or politics and government. They are independent state and dependent state. So which is an independent state and which is a dependent state? When they say in the Constitution, particular state, each state, several states, no state. An independent state is a sovereign state. It is said to be free, sovereign, and independent. A dependent state is a state without sovereignty. It does not exist on its own. It is a legal state or a military state or some other kind of state, but wholly dependent. In the Constitution, we see both of these types of states without qualifying its type. The Constitution does not specify whether it is speaking of an independent state or a dependent state. Yet both the independent and dependent states are addressed within it. They simply use the word state. You may not have realized that both of these states are within the Constitution. The Constitution cannot control the independent states. The Constitution does control the dependent states. You may ask, in reality, which is which? The independent states created the federal government. The federal government created the dependent states. The dependent states are the various military posts inside the dependent states. Such as Fort Hood inside Texas, such as Randolph Air Force Base inside Texas, such as Fort Sam Houston inside Texas, such as Brooks Air Force Base inside Texas, such as Lackland Air Force Base inside Texas, Camp Bullis inside Texas, Corpus Christi Naval Air Station, Kingsville Naval Air Station inside Texas. And here most people are unaware because it's not on the map that there is an Army depot on the Corpus Christi Naval Air Station property. Ellington Air Force Base, and some others. All of these located inside Texas. So you have the federal states, which are the federal lands inside Texas, called State of Texas. And then you have the Republic of Texas, all the rest of the land that was not designated federal property, where there are state citizens who live in the situation, because state is another way of saying situation, and situation is another way of saying state, where the situation for the citizens of Republic of Texas are that they are off federal lands and inside the Republic of Texas. The Republic of Texas, being the government, is a situation. The federal state and the federal people that are on the federal lands are in the situation of being a state controlled by the seat of government. And this is the same for every state. The Constitution states what the dependent states can and cannot do. It also states that the independent states will not interfere with the things the dependent states are doing. Think of the dependent states as the military and the lands they are on. Think of the independent states as basically everywhere else but the seat of government and the military posts. The independent states promise not to interfere with what the military state, or that is, dependent state, does on federal lands, and promises not to interfere with military travels, so in between military posts, okay, in between the military posts and into other states and onto those military posts. Think of the dependent states as islands within the independent states. These islands are military reservations or commonly called posts, or federal lands. The military must be able to move things, people, goods, equipment, mail. They must receive imports, have the right to export, rights to their inventions, commerce in war, wartime traffic, and in peace. Many things that the independent states can do, the federal government reserved for the military force acting as a military state, or that is a dependent state. So every state has a right to certain things, and that includes the military state. So the federal government says no state, meaning any state or all the states, cannot interfere with what the federal state is doing. That does not mean that the federal government has a right to control all the states. It means that the states won't interfere with what the federal government is doing, since the federal government is doing military things. And more importantly, it made a promise to the independent states as to what the federal state, military state, dependent states, or islands within the states will not do. So these federal areas collectively inside Texas make up a federal state called State of Texas. And they promised in the Constitution that they would not erect themselves or create themselves into a new state, or that is a state within a state. So the Constitution allowed them to create a state within the independent state, or a dependent state within the independent state, or a federal state within the independent states. That was allowed. But on these lands that the states gave to the federal government for erecting a military force, they, being the federal state, could not erect another state inside of them. So that would be a independent state with a dependent state, and then another independent state inside of that. If they had, you would get a telescoping effect, a state within a state within a state within a state. And then what happens when they erect an independent state, or try to erect a state within the state within the state, and one of these inner states decide that they want to declare their independence? Now you have an independent state inside a dependent state inside an independent state. So that was the state within the state. So Texas, when it joined the Union, agreed to the Constitution, agreed to sell some lands to the federal government, and agreed to cede the jurisdiction, that is the lawmaking power over the federal lands, to the federal government. And in return, the federal government agreed not to create another state within the state. The independent states were promised that the dependent states would not create themselves into independent states, which would allow them to overtake the independent states to obtain sovereignty. So, in stating that the dependent states would never become independent states, is to say that the military force or federal government would never obtain independence or sovereignty. It cannot be done, and was promised in the Constitution. No military post can create a new state on the lands given to it for military purposes. The lands given or sold to the federal government were sold with conditions. Some states didn't sell the lands. They sort of leased them. Texas leases the lands. But in reality, every state can secede from the Union. Upshur agreed to that. Abel P. Upshur agreed to that. And I'll get into that in another video. These conditions were listed in the Constitution. No states can confederate themselves. This might be confusing because I've talked about how the Constitution was an amendment to the Articles of Confederation and not a repeal or a replacement to the Articles of Confederation. So why does the Constitution say that no state can confederate themselves? And the reason is because it's not talking about the already independent states. It's talking about the federal states created inside the independent states. The federal states cannot align themselves and fight against the independent states for their freedom, their sovereignty, their liberty, their independence. In other words, they cannot confederate themselves. They cannot make themselves independent states. However, the Constitution is commonly misunderstood, and I believe it was a concerted effort by some to alter the perception of the Constitution so that it would appear that the federal government was a government for, or that is over, the free states, or that is the independent states, since the independent states are free states. However, this cannot be done, as the ancient laws that are still good laws today state a tenant, in this case the federal government, cannot become the landlord, in other words, the independent states. The servant, federal government, and military cannot become the master. No servant can make himself into the master of his servant. No tenant can make himself the landlord, and no dependent state can make themselves into independent states. No state lacking sovereignty can confederate themselves, in other words, no military post can confederate itself with other military posts to become independent states or to gain sovereignty or cede from the Union. That cannot be done. So when it's talking about no state can cede from the Union, it's talking about the dependent states. The independent states, being free, sovereign, and independent, can secede from the Union. But they don't want you to know that, because for every state that secedes from the Union becomes weak. No state lacking sovereignty can confederate themselves and make themselves sovereign states. No military force can make themselves into an independent nation within the nation or independent states that created it. When the people of the United States is then understood to be the people of the dependent federal state, as the United States is a dependent state or a federal state, and the confederation that created the United States are a confederation or a firm league of friendship of independent states. When people understand this, the size of the federal government immediately contracts. We might look at the Bill of Rights and the right to bear arms, where it states that a militia being essential to a free state. The free state is the independent states. And the independent states have a militia. The militia is made up of state citizens or private citizens. They are no longer public servants. And as Washington said in his farewell speech, he was excited to leave the federal government as a servant to the people, a public citizen, to live the quiet life as a private citizen on the Potomac River. The free states are the independent states. The federal government is speaking to itself, telling itself it may not infringe on the power of the independent states, as the word arms has several meanings. Arms may mean power, weapons, independence, and defense, and so forth. The right to bear arms may then mean the right to show your power by way of weapons. Independence, defense, etc. This can be done in many ways. By way of a militia, for example. The militia is comprised of private citizens of the independent states who are the free, sovereign, and confederate citizens of the states. Therefore, the militia is a power, and the power is a right. The militia is not simply just a force of men who ready themselves with guns. They also have the right to do all the things the Army, Navy, Air Force, etc. do. This includes the right to courts, writs, declarations, assemblies, as you cannot have any force of a militia without the right to assemble. And people may assemble in courts. They may write writs or declarations. Weapons can be of all kinds. The right to say no can be considered a weapon. The right to say yes, the right to fight, the right to show your power of having unalienable rights, the rights to do all things. When Thomas Jefferson wrote the Declaration of Independence, he wrote that men all have unalienable, or some would argue inalienable, rights. But when man entered into the dependent state and claimed to be a citizen of the United States or United States citizen, or to live in a military state called the United States, and agreed to contracts with the IRS or Fed Bank, they placed themselves into a state of dependency or a situation of dependency. They made themselves legal identities through the application for a legal name on the birth certificate. They made themselves legal identities through the application for a legal name on the birth certificate and made themselves into servants under and for the federal military state. This is not what the founders intended. Benevolent purposes or not, those who have gone outside the Constitution using deceptive practices, which is another type of arm or another type of power, have taken the right to choose from the people since birth. When their mothers signed the birth certificate, then each of us ratified the contract for the legal name at the age of 16, when we used it for applying for and receiving a driver's license, or to get a social security card, and to pay taxes, so on and so forth. There are vast implications to the ideas mentioned, and these implications are ones that will cause the federal government to immediately shrink in size to the level of the founders' intentions. This ends the Federal Reserve, taxation as theft, and many other tyrannical forces leading political societies and corporate societies today. One only needs to think of these implications for a period of time to completely understand how exponentially the government will shrink. As with all things, this takes time and a willingness to accept that we have been taught a great many lies, and accept that they were lies, and have a willingness to learn the truth. So the federal government is a federal state under the Constitution, limited to the federal lands inside the independent states. The federal government has allowed for the Federal Reserve to create a legal state having no actual jurisdiction. If you look to the 14th Amendment, things might start making a lot more sense, where it says, the federal people on the federal lands are not only federal citizens subject to the federal jurisdiction, but also state citizens subject to the state jurisdiction. And that is for a couple of reasons. The first reason is that the federal people on the federal lands wanted to be able to use the resources of the independent state off the federal lands. Because back in the early days, the federal state or the federal military posts were new, and they didn't have a lot of things built on them that families felt they needed, such as schools for their children. And so they kept begging government to do something about it. And so they wanted, this is where we started having contracts with the federal government. The states started having contracts with the federal government to allow for federal children to come off the federal lands into the state to use the schools, because they weren't state taxpayers. So the federal government made federal people federal taxpayers and state taxpayers. So you have a federal citizen who is a federal citizen and also a state citizen. But you do not see where a state citizen is also a federal citizen, because state people not being on federal lands are not subject to federal jurisdiction. However, there are a lot of events that are put on a variety of military posts, such as air shows and 4th of July celebration parties and different things, where they allow state people who are not federal people to go on to the federal lands and visit or see the show. And if a person goes on to federal lands and commits a crime, then they're subject to the federal jurisdiction. So federal jurisdiction on federal land, state jurisdiction on state land, and the federal military posts are considered states, or a federal state within an independent state. And so now the 14th Amendment makes a little bit more sense. What's been done is, during the Civil War, Lincoln wanted to bring the entire independent states under federal control, under federal power. And he did so successfully, but it was a coup and was illegal because it was an act without power to act. He used his constitutional office and the power that came with it to do things outside of the Constitution, which made all those things he did outside of the Constitution illegal. And anything, as we know, and we've heard many times, Anything unconstitutional is void. Not voidable in court, meaning you don't have to go to a court and have it voided. It is automatically void. But in this time, to automatically void something, it has to become common. It has to become well known for all people. Because well-known things or common things do not have to be proven. So if we all agree on what the Constitution is or is not, no one has to go to court to prove that the federal government has limited power. And the power is limited to the federal lands and basically for military purposes. Now, if you go and you read the Constitution and you see all the things that the federal government says it can do, it's talking about the things that it's going to do on the federal lands or the things that the federal people are going to do. So in other words, they're allowed to export and they're allowed to import. That doesn't mean that the federal government gave itself the right to control every independent state's imports and exports. But being part of the union, all the states agree not to interfere with states' imports or exports, other federal states' imports or exports. The same with commerce. The states agree not to interfere with the federal commerce. So the federal military has a right to go off the federal lands to move things around. And having that right, the states agree that they're not going to interfere with that. So it's talking about the state. Now, when there's a war and the federal government is moving things around because the federal government is basically in charge of everything during a war, the states agree not to interfere with those things that the federal government's doing for war purposes, moving things around. And that includes something called wartime traffic. Traffic is not something that just happens all the time. It also happens during war. So you have types of traffic. You have just regular peacetime traffic and you have wartime traffic. Now, the Constitution appears to be something that was written in order to help keep the peace, not to use against the independent states to enlarge the federal state. But that's what they've been doing since at least the Civil War, possibly earlier, possibly since the 1830s. So here you have a video on the general terms and how they have no meaning out of context, but general terms are given meaning within the context. And the problem that we have today is that most people do not understand the context of the Constitution and what kind of meaning it gives to those words. And you have two meanings or two types of state. You have an independent state and a dependent state when in relation to the federal Constitution. So you'll see things like the federal government created the states. It's not the truth and it's not a lie, because generally the federal Constitution did create the states, but it created dependent states. The independent states created the federal government. So did the federal government create states? Yes, but only the dependent ones. Did the federal government create independent states? No, the states became independent when they signed the Declaration of Independence. The states were independent before the institution of the military within the Articles of Confederation, and the states acknowledged their independence in the Articles of Confederation. And then they did an amendment to the Articles of Confederation for the military state or the federal state. And that's the Constitution, the dependent state. So please consider liking, sharing, subscribing, hit the bell notification, and leave a comment. And if you're new to my channel, please consider watching some of my previous videos as I go over these kinds of things quite a lot to help you understand the many lies that you have been told so that you can understand the truth.